Hey everyone, welcome to the channel, and I'm here for a versus video for you guys, and this is actually a band versus video where I take two bands and compare the bands, and I'll let you know which one I think is better. So for this video, we're going to be talking about Queensryche and Fate's Warning, and we're going to compare the two bands and talk about both the bands, and I'll let you know which one I personally like more and the band that I personally think is better. This is just my opinion, of course. If you prefer one band over another, if your opinion's different than mine, that's totally fine with me. But I thought that this would be an interesting comparison video to do. Now, I think both of these bands are great. All right, that goes without saying. They're both great bands, and they're both pioneers in progressive metal. And I will say that I did become a fan of Queensryche first, but not by much. I actually became a fan of Fate's Warning only a couple of months after I got into Queensryche. I just know that I got into both bands in 2019, which I know it's kind of a late time to be getting into these bands, but I mean, better late than never, of course. It is what it is. And 2019 was actually whenever I started to dive more into progressive metal. It was definitely a subgenre of metal that I really wanted to invest more time in, and overall it is one of my favorite subgenres of metal. So let's go ahead and talk about these bands. So for Queensryche, I mean, with their 1980s material with Jeff Tate, I mean, this era of the band was just absolutely spectacular. I mean, especially with albums like The Warning and Operation Mindcrime, which I think is their best work. Operation Mindcrime, I think, is one of the best metal concept albums of all time. So yeah, Queensryche, they were definitely something in the 80s, definitely putting out some of their best work at the time. Same could be said about Fate's Warning as well. In the 80s, you had Awaken the Guardian, No Exit, and Perfect Symmetry. Those are all classics, all great albums. And when it comes to the 80s time, there's definitely some competition here, because both these bands were putting out some of their best material in the 80s, so it's a bit of a tough call. Now, same could be said for the 90s as well, because I think both bands have also put out really great albums in the 90s. Now, with Queensryche, you had Empire, Promised Land, Here and the Now Frontier, and Q2K. Now, I like two of the albums from Queensryche in the 90s time, those being Empire and Promised Land. Here in the Now Frontier, I think is only okay, but Q2K, not too crazy about it, to be honest, but it's not awful or anything. But with Fate's Warning, I will say that I do like I like Fate's Warning more as far as the 90s time is concerned, because with Fate's Warning you had Parallels, Inside Out, and A Pleasant Shade of Grey. Those are all great albums. So I feel like overall Fate's Warning has put out more solid material in the 90s. Now, some people might say that with Empire, like, since Queensryche put out Empire in the 90s, like, Queensryche wins alone just based on that album. But to me, that's not so much how I see it. Now, I think Empire is a great album, but I don't know. I just think you gotta be more objective than that. I just think overall, Fate's Warning has put out more solid albums in the 90s. Now, with the 2000s, this one is kind of an easy one. I think Fate's Warning definitely takes the lead in the 2000s. Now, Fate's Warning, they had Disconnected and X. Now, X, I do think is Fate's Warning's weakest album, but even in saying that, I don't think it's a bad album. Fate's Warning, I mean, I don't think they've ever had a bad album, to be perfectly honest with you. But some are obviously better than others, but the album X is probably the weakest in their catalog. But with Queensryche, you had Tribe, which I think is decent. And then you also had Operation Mindcrime 2 and American Soldier. Now, these two albums I'm not the biggest fan of. Now, American Soldier I think has a cool concept, but the album overall is kind of boring. And Operation Mindcrime 2 I'm not that big of a fan of. I think it is one of the weaker Queensryche records. Now, I do think Fate's Warning is definitely better in the 2000s. Now, what's interesting about Fate's Warning is after the album X, they kind of went on a weird hiatus. I'm actually not sure why they did. That's not really something that I've actually really looked into much. I've actually never really looked into why it took so long for Fate's Warning to come out with another album after the early 2000s. I mean, you guys can let me know in the comments why that is, but yeah, but still, even though Fate's Warning has only had 2 albums in the 2000s, I think that they were better than Queensryche in the 2000s, I'd say. Now, we got to talk about the 2010s, the 2010s decade. Now, this one is also a bit of a tough call. Now, what's interesting with Queensryche is this is when they started putting out their weakest material with Jeff Tate, of course, Dedicated to Chaos and Frequency Unknown, which I think are their weakest albums. That goes without saying. But whenever they got Todd Latour on vocals, I mean, the band really did get back on track. The self-titled album, I think, is really solid. Same could be said about Condition Human. And The Verdict, I think, is the best Queensryche album with Todd on vocals. So when it comes to the 2010s decade of Queensryche, it was like good and bad, you know? Like at the start, it was like, wow, they're putting out their weakest material. And then Todd Latour basically saved the band with the 3 albums that he was involved in. I mean, all the albums that he did with Queensryche are definitely very, very good. Now, when it comes to Fate's Warning, they've only had 2 in the 2010s, and of course, 1 in the 2020s, that being Long Day Good Night, of course, which I think is still a very solid album. But in the 2010s, you had Darkness in a Different Light and Theories of Flight, which are both very good albums. Now, Darkness in a Different Light, I think, is another one of Fate's Warning's weakest albums, but not bad, though. There is some good stuff on that album. Theories of Flight, though, that's an excellent album. I think it's maybe the best of their modern era. Either this album or Long Day Good Night. I'm still kind of in debate about that, I guess. Like, I'm not really sure which one I like more because I think they're both excellent albums. I might like them both the same for different reasons. I don't know, but they're both great albums, though. So with this one, it is kind of a tough call. It really is. But as far as my overall stance when it comes to both bands, I will say that overall, I like Fate's Warning more than Queensryche. Now, if you were to ask me in 2019, I probably would have said Queensryche because in 2019, that's when I was really on a really big Queensryche binge, I guess you could say. But, you know, if I'm being objective here and which band I think has been more consistent, who has put out the more solid albums, I'm going to go with Fate's Warning. They definitely have been more consistent. Like I said, they've never released a bad album, in my opinion. Now, I'm sure there's a few albums that some people don't like. I know some people don't like X or Inside Out. Now, X, I think, is their weakest album, but it's not bad. Inside Out is actually kind of an underrated album, in my opinion. That album is actually not bad. It's not bad at all. But consistency, Fate's Warning definitely wins when it comes to consistency, for sure. And again, they just have more better albums. Now, you could make the argument that Queensryche has the higher highs than Fate's Warning does. I mean, I'm not sure if I'd go that far personally, but you could make that argument. But Queensryche has definitely had the lower lows than Fate's Warning has with their lows. Of course, when we're talking about albums like Operation Mindcrime 2 and Dedicated to Chaos. So, Fate's Warning, they win for me. So, there you have it. That's my versus video. Let me know what you think. Which band do you prefer, Fate's Warning or Queensryche? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day and take care.